Hello and welcome to day 40. We are at Leviticus chapters 10 to 12 and Acts chapter 16. Leviticus starts with a very strange story. Two of Aaron's sons have become priests, and they decided to do some worshiping with what was called strange fire, and God zaps them dead. Now, this is one of those strange stories that a lot of people are like, this is why I don't read the Old Testament. I would just say that this is not a capricious moment where God is just randomly zapping people. In this case, as we have read, God has given us very specific instructions for worship in the tent of meeting. Now, we don't necessarily follow all of these instructions today, but at the time, it was an important piece of the relationship that was developing between the Israelites and God after they had left Egypt. Egypt, of course, had a very well developed pattern of rituals and sacrifices and practices for worshiping their gods. And our God wanted to establish a different relationship. And so there were some very specific rules and regulations. In this particular case, what they did seems to be trying to get a fire going in one of their own pans. And in some of the Jewish study guides that I looked at, they talked about how God was the one doing the lighting of the fire. God was the one in control. And in this case, these two priests were perhaps overzealous in wanting to do something really well, but perhaps they were also trying to take a little bit of control for themselves through the process of offerings and sacrifices. In whatever case, the priests did not follow the instructions that God gave, and the priests were not putting God's instructions first. They were coming up with their own ideas. Now, last year, a book was published that also used this phrase, strange fire. And it was a very interesting book to read. It was talking about the nationalism, the Christian nationalism that has become a very strong movement in the United States right now. And one of the things that it was pointing out is that there are a number of Christians who seem to be starting to place a greater emphasis in their life on government and political leaders rather than God. And the author of this book made the case that perhaps some of us are following in a similar pathway to these two sons of Aaron, where we're trying to take a little bit more control and power over some part of our life. And that this is not in alignment with the instructions that God has given us throughout Scripture, not just in Leviticus, but throughout Scripture. Instructions that make it very clear that God sees people of other nations as being God's people as well, that God does not lift up one nation as higher or more exceptional than another nation. And so there are still people who reference this strange fire incident in the Old Testament even today, and do look at it for a warning of what are the behaviors that we might be doing where we are stepping in and trying to take some power away from God, trying to give ourselves more power, and are we really staying in alignment with the direction God is calling us to go? The next instructions, a lot of it gets very detailed, and some of it is hard for us to read in our time. But overall, as you're going through here, keep in mind that there's a dichotomy here. There's a two-part life that is our worldview that is being set forward here. There is holy and there's unholy. There's clean, there's unclean. There is sacred, there's ordinary. Now, this isn't necessarily saying that the holy is good and the unholy is bad, because a lot of the unholy things are regular parts of our everyday lives. What this is really trying to clarify for us is that there are some things that we should be setting aside as being particular to God and that we should treat in a certain place. Maybe it's a certain time in our life, in our day, in our week. Maybe it's a certain place that we treat differently than everything else, and that we go through some sort of ritual purification to wash the layer of ordinariness, of non-holiness off of us when we are coming into God's presence, whether it's a place or a time. And so don't worry too much about specific details here, but do think about what is the balance in our lives? What is it that God is saying, this is mine and this is yours? This is a special thing and this is an ordinary thing. Because I think it is still valuable for us to set things aside for God in our time, in our space, in our belongings, and have a special relationship with God in the physical world as well as in the spiritual world. Chapter 11 goes through a long list of dietary rules. These days we know these as kosher. A lot of it here, there's variety of opinions as to what exactly God's getting at with the specific animals that he's talking about here. There are some scholars who think that this is somewhat random and that there isn't a particular reason for some of these food rules. But more importantly, the entire set of food rules was something that set the Israelites apart compared to their neighbors. Everyone knew who the Israelites were because they ate certain things and didn't eat other things. It was a way of holding the community together. It was also a way of having the community stay connected to God. Chapter 12 goes into some of the rules around childbirth. And again, childbirth rituals for cleanliness or holiness after giving birth. Um, it's like with the other things, there are some things that are God's, there are some things that are ordinary, there are some things we simply need to wash off of ourselves before we come into God's presence. There's nothing here that indicates that childbirth is not holy and good. It's just that there needs to be a process of cleansing before coming back into God's presence. There are some people who are concerned about the difference in time and ritual after the birth of a male child versus the birth of a female child. And again, there's a variety of opinions among scholars for this. I will say that there are some scholars that actually lift this up, that the additional time after giving birth to a female child perhaps has more to do with the life-giving aspect of women who give birth, and that there is a longer period of ritual purification to acknowledge the fact that the female child will itself most likely be giving birth and bringing life into the world at some point in the future. So don't necessarily look at the difference as a negative, that somehow there's something wrong with the girl babies and moms have to do more to recover from that. It may be actually a point of honor and looking forward to future life that will be coming from these women. Finishing up with our reading in Acts 16, Paul has a dream. He's put together a plan to continue bringing the message of Jesus to more people in the area that we call Turkey today, or Asia Minor. But he gets a vision of a man in Macedonia, which would be across the straits and into the area that we now know as Europe. And Paul is obedient to this vision and he decides to go. And he ends up in the first city that he gets to. He meets Lydia, who is a strong female leader. She is a rich businesswoman. She comes to believe, she's been looking for greater spiritual understanding, and she believes the message that Paul brings about Jesus has her entire household baptized, which this alone, we often gloss over this, but this shows that she is the head of her household. Generally, in this time period, when the leader of the household, generally the male, comes to believe in a new religion or a new God, what the leader says, the patriarch or the matriarch says, goes for the entire household. And so this is standard, that whoever the leader of the household believes in, the entire household believes. But this shows just how important a leader Lydia is, and the strength that she has and the reach that she has. She goes on to say that she's going to host the disciples. This is more than just, oh, why don't you stay over here for the night on your way traveling through? This type of hosting is really more like financial support. She is making a commitment, not just of her soul, but of also her financial resources to support the disciples as they are going and sharing the message of Jesus to more people. Now, Lydia is the first of three people that come very quickly here in the story that come to believe in Jesus. And it's very important to think about this as a whole. We first have Lydia. The next story is about a slave girl who is freed from some demons, and she is freed from her slavery. Um, uh, and then we have the Roman soldier who is worried about his own life after Paul is released from jail. And he ends up coming to believe. Now, these three people, Lydia, the slave girl, and the Roman soldier, a lot of times we don't read the three together as a complete story. We read each of them separately and think of them as individual separate events. But I think it is really important to understand that in the Jewish tradition, there was a sense that women and slaves and foreigners were people who were less than in the Jewish tradition. They could not go into the same areas of the temple for worship. They did not have the same rights and they did not have the same standing. As we read these three together, we see that Paul has no hesitation interacting with all three of these people, bringing them the message of Jesus, and immediately welcoming them into the early church. And I think this is something that we need to struggle with today. Who are the people in our world that we think of as being less than, that somehow need more care and watching over, or maybe we're uncomfortable around them? But I think we can all come up with a list of people. When I watch the news, it seems that we are setting aside non citizens as different, transgender people or low income people as somehow different with different needs, different expectations, perhaps people with mental health issues or people who are struggling with addictions. I think we can each come up with our own lists of people that make us uncomfortable or who we think aren't maybe quite as ready for having the same role in the church as other people. I think the challenge when we're reading Paul in this chapter of Acts is, what are we doing to go out and find these people and bring the good news of Jesus to them? Are there things we need to do in our life to have a space for them where they feel safe, where they feel welcome, where they can be fully engaged just as we are? I think this is very challenging. I think it's been challenging to every generation of believers since the time of Paul. The list of people that are set aside as somehow different or less than is different in every place and every time. But I think we've all struggled with this, and I think it is something that Paul continues to be a role model for us to step forward and to reach out to people in new ways. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.